Morty! He's a mushroom. Oh no. What kind of mushroom are you, Morty? My name's Kyle. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department at CU Boulder. I trained as an epidemiologist, and so that's a person who tracks disease. So my area of research in mycology is how fungi interact with humans, specifically in terms of disease. What changes in the fungi to allow them to adapt to our bodies and to survive in our bodies, which are actually really harsh environments. Fungi aren't supposed to be there. Not many people talk about it, not many people study it, and it felt like the natural direction for me to go into when pursuing a higher degree.
Thanks so much for sitting down to speak with us, Kyle. So what do you do?
I'm kind of at the nexus of basic cell biology, so understanding how cells respond to stress, and evolutionary biology, which is how that changes over time and space. Within fungal cell biology and evolutionary biology, I focus on a group of organisms known as the yeasts. And yeasts are unicellular fungi, so that means they're just one cell, unlike your bigger mushrooms that have many cells. And I work with a group of yeasts called Candida. This is a genus, so this is just a group of yeasts, and they have a large proportion of those yeasts are human pathogens. So what it takes for a fungi to be able to cause disease in a human or an animal, that's what I study.
Can you describe how a yeast looks?
Yeah, a yeast is essentially, or at least the yeast I work with are in a group of yeast called the budding yeast. So typically you'll see under the microscope just a nice little oval. And then occasionally you'll see a little small oval attached to that oval, and that is the bud. And that will become a daughter cell, so that will bud off and become its own cell. But yeah, under the microscope, they're pretty simple.
Why did you get into this area of mycology to begin with?
I don't know how serious you want to go, but people dying of these infections and not really understanding how people get these infections, how fungi are transmitting between people, and that really, to me, was the call to start answering some of these questions and looking into areas that haven't been explored before.
Why should we care about this?
Yeah, this is a pretty understudied topic overall. I would say there's estimated to be about 1.5 billion cases of fungal infections every year. Many of these are beyond just like athlete's foot. These are serious, like systemic or bloodstream infections. And we're seeing increases in resistance to treatment. So there's been a lot of treatment failure. People aren't able to recover as easily from these infections. And that in turn drives up the mortality rate from these infections. So it's a pretty important area to focus on because it does affect a lot of people.
Science is obviously an iterative process. That being said, has your research yielded anything thus far?
So this part of my research, I've compared yeasts that don't cause disease in humans to yeasts that do cause disease in humans. And I look to understand if there was a single transition from a non-disease causing lifestyle to a disease causing lifestyle. And I didn't find that in this group of yeast. So really what that suggests is that yeasts are really versatile in where they can live, and they can adapt to many new environments, including the human body, which is a really harsh environment. And so this is an important context to have when you think about how pathogens or organisms that cause disease in humans evolve over time and space.
How do you expect the importance of your research to change over time, especially given the advent of something like climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one hypothesis or thought behind why we're seeing an increase in yeasts that can cause disease in humans is that as our ambient temperature, the temperature outside increases, that's a selective pressure that acts on these yeasts to be able to survive at higher temperatures, and our bodies are really warm, and so that means more things can survive in our body. So yeah, I do see, or there is a really strong thought process behind climate change directly affecting the emergence of new fungal disease-causing organisms. There's only 4 types of drugs that we can use to treat fungal infections, and two of those are really harsh on the body. So if you do have a really serious infection, there aren't many treatment options, and if the organism that's affecting you is resistant to those, then there are no options, and so you really can only be treated with supportive care, and that's...
So now let's focus on Kyle, the scientist. How did you start in science? Was there a specific moment that you can remember?
Honestly, the very first thing, my parents bought me a toy microscope, and I just loved that so much. And I remember finding, it was kind of gross, but a dead deer carcass and taking samples from this carcass and looking at it under the scope in my treehouse, and my mom just completely losing it. That is so gross. What are you doing? But just really this idea of looking into the microscopic world was just so cool to me.
Well, that's disgusting. So moving on to something a little bit more palatable, what does it mean to you to be a scientist?
I think when I think about how I will explain this to my 2-year-old one day when he's older, I think it's so cool to be able to ask questions and then get to find out answers to those questions, or possible answers or explanations to those questions. And for me, that's invaluable. And I'm a very curious person. I've always been a very curious person. And yeah, I think just having the latitude to be able to ask questions and then have the ability to, in the knowledge, to set up experiments to test those hypotheses and change the way that I view things in the world. And that goes outside the lab too. I mean, I definitely apply that scientific method to a lot of different aspects of my life. And I really value that in my training.
Did you ever falter in persevering as a scientist?
Yes, I have failed many times. And I've had many moments even now where I have to check myself. And I think with graduate school in particular, it's this constant push. It pushes you past your comfort zone, and it's a really uncomfortable feeling until you get to that point, and then you cross that barrier and you realize, oh, that actually wasn't that bad. And oh, it actually made me a better person, or it really opened my mind to something new. But it can be very uncomfortable at times, and so finding a space that you can explore that is huge. But yeah, I could list pages of times that I've failed or had ideas that were just not good, but that's all part of the experience. I mean, even when I look back at my application to grad school, I had to write a proposal for a project I wanted to do, and it seems so amateur now, and just to see how much I've developed over 3 years is really, really important perspective, because think about how much you'll develop over 10 years or 20 years. So it's a constant growing, a constant learning, and you have to be okay failing. And I always tell students that I teach that it's unfortunate that failing is attached to our GPA, but honestly, you learn the most from the experiences you fail at.
Is there anything about the graduate school program you wish to see changed? And if there is, how might you see that change become real?
That's a good question. I think there's a lot of pressure to publish. At least in academia, the mindset is that you will continue on in academia, and so that's why there's this pressure to publish, because it helps you get interviews or postdocs or faculty positions. I mean, I'm not really considering to stay in academia, and so I don't feel this like publish or perish vibe as much as other people do. It's really hard to publish. It takes a lot of time. It's very expensive. The journals that I publish in cost anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 to just submit a paper. And my typical budget for a year for lab stuff is like $6,000 or $7,000. So, you know, it can be a real roadblock to getting your work out there, and it's very stressful to do that piece of it. I will say my department is very relaxed about that. I don't personally feel that pressure as much, but it's still out there. And if you interact with other graduate students across the country, it's everybody's kind of first thing is like, oh, I just got to get this paper published, And we're training. I think too, it's hard as a graduate student because you think that you're going to do something that's going to win a Nobel Prize, but really you're a scientist in training. And so your projects aren't going to be top level groundbreaking things. They're going to be more like, let's contribute to the bigger picture. And I think having that perspective is always really good and kind of grounding. How would I change it? I mean, I think maybe having more journals, they're like graduate student led, or are early career journals where people aren't established labs but don't necessarily need to be and can publish their work maybe cheaply or with some sort of agreement that allows them to publish with no cost.
Those are great ideas. Obviously, as mushrooms, graduate school isn't available to us, but we can imagine that not having an accessible outlet for your work is disappointing, to say the least. That's in part why we're here with you now. Though in this format, you're not speaking directly to your peers. And we expect most of the viewers of this interview to be non-scientists, or the science or mushroom curious at least. In light of that, what's the biggest challenge you face in communicating your work to the general public?
There's a few things, but I think in general, in my experience as an epidemiologist, that it's very easy to lose connection with somebody when you start to speak heavy jargon, or you start to throw out ideas or concepts that are foreign to people. And I think in a situation like infectious diseases, which is already a really scary situation, you have to be extra careful about how you communicate with people to make sure that they're understanding what you're telling them, but also still like maintaining, you know, the severity of the situation, or you know, maintaining that this is a serious situation. And so that's a challenge in balancing how much jargon to use, how to pitch something to make it understandable but not lose its meaning.
The field of mycology is very interesting, and it's inspired many people to see the world in a different way. But as someone that has a very intimate relationship with it, what is something that you might want to see change in the field?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think that our global surveillance for fungal infections is pretty underwhelming. A lot of countries track certain fungal infections, but much emphasis, or most of the emphasis, is placed on bacteria and obviously viruses, right? We just are still in the midst of a pandemic. And so my hope is that mycology also has a seat at the table, and that people acknowledge that fungal infections are serious and they're a growing problem and it's not going away. I mean, if you think about all of the cases of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 that ended up in the ICU, all of those people are extra susceptible to fungal infections. So it is kind of a domino effect, and it seems really sad to not acknowledge that piece of it.
Well, we certainly agree with you, Kyle. We also want fungi to have a seat at the table. And these definitely sound like things that we should be taking into consideration. Let's wrap things up with one last question that's slightly unorthodox. If you were to compare your developmental stage as a person and as a scientist to that of a mushroom, where do you think you would be?
To relate to the fungal life cycle, I think I would put myself in the primordia, which is this really beautiful stage where the mushrooms, so not really yeast, is breaking through the surface, and seeing the world for the first time. And I feel that way all the time. Every time I read a new paper or go to a new conference or take a different seminar, I feel like I'm breaking through to this huge world of knowledge. And that is kind of where I would place myself comparatively. Both as a father, that every day is like being in the primordia, but definitely as a scientist, because there's just so much knowledge and facts and information out there to learn, and I've barely scratched the surface.
Well, Kyle, this has been an absolute pleasure. It seems a safe bet that most people don't think of disease-causing yeasts when they think of fungi, yet they're no less a part of the picture than your average mushroom. Maybe this will be eye-opening for some. Should the curious mind wish to explore your work further, how might they go about doing this?
Yeah, a great place to connect with me is obviously through my lab website, where you can see publications and updates on my research.
Again, thanks, Kyle.
Thank you, Nexus Alternatives.